The cafe hummed with morning energy, the scent of fresh coffee and toasted bagels filling the air as baristas worked swiftly behind the counter. Businessmen sat hunched over laptops, couples chatted softly, and tourists flipped through travel brochures. It was the usual morning rush in Parker's Cafe, a popular downtown spot where people came to unwind, talk, and pretend the world outside wasn't as harsh as it was. At a quiet corner table near the window, Dan Briggs, a 65-year-old retired Army veteran, sat sipping his coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic mug. His old military jacket rested over his chair, the faded insignia on the sleeve barely visible, worn down by time. He wasn't here to talk, wasn't here to be noticed. He just wanted his coffee. At a nearby table, a group of young professionals in tailored suits filled the air with self-important conversation and hollow laughter. Among them sat Ethan Wallace, a wealthy investment banker, the kind of man who thought the world bent to his will. He was in his mid-30s, sharp-dressed, sharp-tongued, and full of himself. Ethan barely noticed the old man sitting a few feet away. He was too busy holding court with his friends, loudly complaining about a recent business deal that hadn't gone his way. "This country is soft," he scoffed, swirling the espresso in his tiny cup. "We keep worshiping guys like him." He flicked his chin toward Dan without even lowering his voice. "Just because they wore a uniform decades ago, like that somehow makes them more important than the rest of us." The table chuckled. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story." Dan didn't look up. He'd heard men like Ethan before, but Ethan wasn't done. "Seriously," he went on, shaking his head. "I see these old vets all the time, walking around expecting respect, just because they fought in some war nobody even remembers anymore." He leaned back, taking a sip of coffee. "You know what real sacrifice is? Working 18-hour days to make something of yourself. Not sitting around in a bar swapping war stories about a past that doesn't matter anymore." The table laughed again, though some of the chuckles were a little hesitant now. A few glanced toward Dan, unsure. Dan slowly placed his cup down. He didn't move, didn't turn, didn't react. And that silence, that unnerved Ethan. So he did something stupid. With a smirk, he reached across the table, grabbed a napkin, and flicked it toward Dan's table. It landed near his cup, barely making a sound. "Hey, Grandpa," Ethan called, his voice laced with mockery. "You good over there? Need me to cover your coffee? I know retirement checks aren't what they used to be." The cafe went dead silent. Even the barista at the counter froze mid-pour. A few patrons glanced between Ethan and Dan, waiting. Dan took a slow breath, steadying himself. His fingers drummed once against the table, as if measuring the weight of the moment. Then, finally, he turned. And when he did, Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Because those weren't the tired, weak eyes of an old man. They were sharp, piercing, cold as steel. And Ethan had just made the worst mistake of his morning. Maybe even of his life. Ethan Wallace had always been good at reading people. In his world, power belonged to the confident, the fast-talking, the ones who controlled the room. He had spent his whole career mastering that, walking into meetings with a swagger that told everyone he was the smartest man in the room. But now sitting across from Daniel Briggs, a man who had barely moved, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. Dan didn't speak right away. He just looked at Ethan, the deep lines on his face unreadable, his hands steady. It was a look that made Ethan feel exposed, stripped down to his weakest parts. The room was silent, the cafe crowd watching, waiting. Then, finally, Dan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You ever held a dying man's hand, son?" The words were soft, but they cut through the air like a blade. Ethan blinked. "What?" "You ever looked a man in the eye?" Dan continued, his voice calm, knowing he wasn't gonna make it, knowing he was about to die in a place he never should have been, for a country that forgot about him the second his boots left the ground. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Dan kept going, his voice slow, deliberate. "I have. More times than I can count." He let that settle before leaning back. "And you think working 18-hour days makes you tired?" Ethan shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of just how quiet the cafe had become. His friends weren't laughing anymore. The barista wasn't pouring coffee. The old couple by the window had stopped eating. Every single person in that cafe was listening. Dan let out a breath, shaking his head. "You think men like me sit around waiting for a thank you? Son, we don't expect gratitude. We don't expect anything. But what we sure as hell don't deserve is to be mocked by a man who's never seen a day of real struggle in his life." Ethan swallowed hard, but Dan wasn't done. "You know what real sacrifice looks like?" Dan's voice had an edge now, a quiet, simmering intensity. "It's watching your best friend bleed out in a jungle 3,000 miles from home. It's holding on to a photo of your wife and kid, wondering if you'll ever see them again. It's spending years living with the ghosts of the men who never made it back, knowing damn well it could have been you." Ethan's fingers clenched around his coffee cup. He wanted to fight back, wanted to win the conversation the way he always did. But how the hell do you argue with a man who had held death in his hands and survived? Dan shook his head. "And yet, here you are, talking about how men like me expect something from you. Like we're just sitting around waiting for a damn medal." Ethan licked his lips, but his mouth was dry. He glanced at his friends, looking for support, but none of them would meet his eye. Dan leaned back in his chair. "You've never had to fight for a damn thing in your life, have you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Dan smirked. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't even angry. It was the smirk of a man who had already won. Ethan had walked into this cafe thinking he was the strongest person in the room. And now, for the first time in his life, he knew he wasn't. The silence stretched. Dan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as he picked up his coffee. "Didn't think so." Ethan's face burned, because for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Ethan Wallace sat frozen in his seat, his fingers tight around his coffee cup, though he wasn't drinking. His mouth had gone dry, his heart pounded against his ribs. And the cafe, once filled with the comfortable hum of morning conversation, now felt like a courtroom where he was the one on trial. He had walked in here expecting to own the room, to be the witty, arrogant businessman who always had the last word. But now, sitting across from a man who had seen and survived more than Ethan could ever imagine, he felt like a child. Daniel Briggs sipped his coffee slowly, unbothered, unrushed, unshaken. He had spent a lifetime facing men who actually wanted to kill him. Ethan Wallace wasn't even a challenge. Ethan forced a smirk, a desperate attempt to claw back control. "All right," he said, shifting in his seat. "I get it. You've had a rough life. War changes a man, sure. But what? You expect me to just bow down because you had it tough?" The words barely left his mouth before he regretted them. Because instead of anger, Dan just laughed, a slow, deep chuckle that somehow felt worse than a threat. "Bow down?" Dan shook his head, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Son, I don't need a damn thing from you, least of all your respect." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Then what's all this about?" Dan leaned forward, setting his coffee cup down carefully, as if even that action had more control and presence than anything Ethan had done all morning. "This is about the fact that you walked in here believing you were the biggest man in the room," Dan said, his voice calm but razor sharp. "But the thing about real strength, it doesn't need to be proven." Ethan exhaled sharply, trying to hold on to his pride. "You don't know anything about me." Dan tilted his head. "I know enough." Ethan's jaw clenched. "You think you got it all figured out, don't you? That just because you fought in a war, it makes you better than the rest of us?" Dan's smile faded, and for the first time, there was a hardness in his eyes that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Better?" Dan repeated slowly. "Number not better." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "But I sure as hell earned what I have. Can you say the same?" Ethan stiffened. Dan didn't look away. "You work 18-hour days, huh? Good for you. But you know what real work looks like? Digging a trench in the middle of a jungle, knowing a sniper's watching you, waiting for you to lift your head at the wrong second." Ethan swallowed, but Dan kept going. "You ever go 3 days without sleep, your body running on fumes, because the second you close your eyes, you might not wake up? You ever had to carry your friend's body back to camp, feeling the life slip out of them with every step, knowing damn well that bullet could have had your name on it instead?" Ethan's fingers twitched. He hated this. hated feeling small, exposed. Dan sat back, shaking his head. The difference between you and me, son? I don't need to prove who I am. I already did, a long time ago. Ethan clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He wanted to fight back, to throw something at Dan that would shut him up. But how do you argue with a man who had already faced death and won? He looked around, realizing how every single person in the cafe was watching. Not one of them was on his side. Even his own friends sat stiffly, their eyes darting away, not wanting to be associated with him right now. He had lost. And the worst part, he knew it. The barista, Emily, finally broke the silence, clearing her throat. "Maybe you should go," she said, looking at Ethan with barely concealed disappointment. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had come in here thinking he was untouchable. Now, he was the guy who had just been humiliated in front of an entire cafe. Slowly, stiffly, he pushed back his chair and stood. His face burned as he grabbed his coffee cup, his hands trembling slightly. Dan didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He just watched, calm as ever, as Ethan turned and walked out the door. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool air hitting him like a slap. For the first time in his life, he had no comeback. And that silence? It was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Ethan Wallace had never known what true silence felt like until now. As he stepped outside the cafe, the world around him carried on. Cars honked, people walked by, life moved forward, but inside his head, everything was still. The usual self-assurance that carried him through life was gone, stripped away by the weight of a man who hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to fight him, hadn't needed to do anything but tell the truth. For the first time, Ethan wasn't the strongest person in the room, and he hated it. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The cafe door swung shut behind him, sealing him off from the quiet conversations and the eyes he had felt burning into him just moments ago. His hands trembled slightly, his stomach churned, and the coffee cup he had held onto so tightly now felt useless. He looked down at it, then, without a word, he tossed it into the nearest bin. The bitter taste in his mouth had nothing to do with the drink. He turned away from the cafe, shoving his hands into his pockets, his heart still racing from the confrontation. Every step felt heavier than it should have. Every breath was thicker, slower. This was different from losing a deal at work, different from an argument with a client, because this wasn't about business. This was about who he was, and the worst part, he didn't like what he saw. His reflection in the glass of a storefront caught his attention. His perfectly tailored suit, his polished shoes, his confident stance. On any other day, he would have looked at himself and thought, that's success. But now, all he saw was a man who had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable, only to be cut down in minutes by a man who had already proved everything that mattered. A man who had fought wars, lost friends, earned his place in the world. Ethan had spent his life taking. Daniel Briggs had spent his life giving. That realization hit Ethan harder than anything Dan could have thrown at him. For a moment, he thought about just walking away, forgetting it ever happened, burying it like every other uncomfortable truth he'd faced in life. But something stopped him, a thought, an impulse. Before he could talk himself out of it, he turned back toward the cafe. The doorbell chimed softly as he stepped inside again. Conversations quieted for just a moment as people noticed his return. Dan still sat in his booth, his coffee nearly finished, his military jacket draped over his chair like it had always been. He didn't look surprised to see Ethan walk back in. He just waited. Ethan cleared his throat, stepping toward the table. His voice wasn't as strong as it usually was, but he made sure to meet Dan's gaze. I was wrong. Dan arched an eyebrow but said nothing. Ethan let out a slow breath. About you, about a lot of things. Dan nodded slightly. Figured. Ethan glanced around, realizing how quiet the cafe had become again. He swallowed hard and pulled a napkin from the holder, jotting something down quickly. When he was done, he slid it across the table toward Dan. It was an address. The Veterans Center, Ethan said, stepping back. I've never talked to a guy who's been through what you have, but I want to. Dan studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not he was serious. Then he picked up the napkin and nodded. Ethan took another breath, glancing at the barista, Emily, who was watching with quiet approval. He gave her a slight nod, then turned and walked back toward the door. As he stepped outside, something strange happened. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he needed to win. For the first time in his life, he just wanted to understand. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first real step toward becoming a man worth respecting. The end.